happen. And I think, you know, when we're so distracted, you know, when so much is coming at us, when they took our heads of states out, we haven't had an opportunity, like you said, to come back and go, hey, everybody bring it in. Let's recoup. They've just taken out our heads of states. We got to kind of reconstitute this, see where we are and where we need to go from there. We didn't. Instead, we took who they put as the heads and we followed them, and they've led us into never ever land. You know? Exactly, exactly. And I am convinced the ones who are going to have to communicate the truth about it are the ones who are impacted the most, simply because I think as a woman, because you have the option to either bring forth that life or take it. I'm not talking about what it takes to make a baby, because everybody can say it takes two to make a baby, but only one can bring it here. And the fact that you have the option not to bring it here, if we've made the option to bring them here, then now us, more so than anybody else, have the responsibility to taking care of them. So I don't give a fuck about whether a man is there or not, because we made that choice. Do you understand? And so therefore we have the responsibility, so that when we find that for whatever reason the man is not there in the capacity in which one would suggest he needs to be, then we just got to double up, because that's what we say. Bring it in. So and so is not getting the proper coverage. He's good at what he does, so we need to double up on him. So we just need to double up is the point. And what we have to prepare ourselves for is that when we double up, you got this conversation out there about how we're too masculine and how we're taking over the role, this, that, and the other. And I've heard conversations where men have determined that they're going to take the role now that they suggest had been given to women, and women has filed up to the point that now it's their responsibility to take. And I'm like, okay, let's see how that works out. That's the only thing I say. Let's see how that works out. You know, so I say, well, I think again is an example for many reasons. For many reasons, because you know, in St. Louis and DC and New York, they have their trials, and we're dying in the streets there too. But for whatever reason, you know, they're highlighting Chicago. And I think it's because a lot of our history is still written and there for everybody to see in Chicago. You know, it's like forever keeping your feet on Haiti. Why? Because it was the only nation that truly rebelled and took control over the government, you know, unlike other African states. And so then I say, well, then there is where we need to put forth our greatest effort as well, since there's so much effort, you know, to mark our possibilities, because that's what they're doing. They're erasing history and rewriting it. It's just they're doing it with flesh and blood. And I think that's what we don't understand. By the time they get to the pen, the flesh, the bones, and the blood has already carried it out. And so when you see them trying to rewrite history and erase you out of it, you got to have a response, and you got to have a response in flesh, blood, and body, which is why I say all this communication about going off into the nether and the ether. Unless you coming back as Shaka Zulu, I don't understand what you're going there for. Unless you're coming back as Harriet Tubman or Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey, why are you going? Because if I was, I would kick you out. And even when men moved in the 60s, and I say that because it's closer than the 30s, but whenever a man moved, it was because he had enough respect for the woman for her to play a role, to be his comforter and his inspiration, his reflection of the man that he truly is and is to be, because you're always in that motion of becoming. And so then when they had you go against her, who's your reflection? Who's your inspiration? Who's your comfort? Yeah, out. And he understood that, which is why, and it never fails. Watch every so-called Caucasian president, and you will be able to see who he puts next to himself. And it's going to be a black woman. You know what I mean? Because she knows us. She knows human nature and animal nature too. And he respects her for that, where you don't. And he listens to her. You watch Trump, And more so than any other coon around him, you're going to always find his daughter. More so, not his sons, his daughter. There's a keenness that we have. You know, and our issue as women, you can't be browbeated for years and years by your own man, and that not have an effect on you to the point that you don't even want to show your intelligence. They're so big on, well, young boys not wanting to be smart anymore and this, that, and the other. Young girls don't want to be smart anymore either. Women don't want to be smart either. They don't want to be protectors. They don't want to say anything but what they hear parroted on TV. Why? Because that's what you watch so much. So that's the conversation. They cannot see for you what they cannot see for themselves. Hey, and exactly. And when it all comes down to it, I think you would know it because again, who and what it is that make us up. And so again, that's why you reverence something. You reverence something because you're a part of it, no doubt, and it has a special connection to you, no doubt, and yet and still it has something above you, but because it's connected to you and looks out for you, there's a reverence you give to it because you know it's not your enemy, it's your caretaker. So there's no room for envy because you'd be envying your own support. Who does that but one who does not have that support? And so that's the one that you're listening to, the one that does not have that support because he does not have that connection. You have a connection with us that they don't have, although we gave birth to both. You understand? Nature feeds both, but what nature feeds us versus what nature feeds them is two totally different feedings because they can't digest it all. So now they're envious of the fact that you're getting it all. So now they're psyching you out of it. So now you going, yeah, I don't want that. And then wondering why you at the bottom. Our Moorish heritage to discuss Hebrew Israelite, which again, all was a communication of what our nationalities were. Then they co-opted. And when they co-opted and put it in that lane, whatever they do, the most that one would conceptualize about it is whatever they sing about it in a song, which is a motherfucking rhyme. But it's not political. It will have no bearing socially, so it won't move you. So then when someone says, now this is what you do with the understanding of your Moorish nationality, this is what you do with an understanding of your Hebrew Israelite nationality, your thing is if Jay-Z didn't say it, if Lamar didn't say it, because now those are your leaders. And it's understood that's how your mind have been trained to respond. And that's why it's detrimental because now I said to someone, I said, now it's ironic how the only thing she was noted for, to me, was sliding across the stage half naked. The only thing she gave you for a couple hours straight was the softest porn you ever want to see. So then she get knocked up with twins and now all of a sudden she comes out and she is representing the mother of the universe? Really? Really? So now, once she dropped the twins and she goes out on stage again, you trying to tell me she's no longer gonna come out there half naked? So now again, you cut black woman off from realizing the divinity of herself, of motherhood, at a time where she's struggling with it because she's losing so many in the street. You cutting that off. And I told him, if you're under the impression that Kendrick Lamar is going to be able to continue to spit that as if the ones who control that aren't the same ones that's making the nigga over here saying, bitch, better have my money. Because again, that's the proliferation is she's a hoe. And the only thing she was the hoe that was saying that, yes, I'm a hoe, but I'm the pimp of this game. And that's what she was giving credit for. She was not only one who was controlling the brothel house, but she was the one that was going to be really aligned with the top pimp himself. That's all. that is being communicated. But now all of a sudden, let me get this right. Your kids will be named with royal connotation. Really? So then who's your subjects? And that's what people don't understand, because if you have a kingdom, you have subjects. And historically, what's the response to your subjects but to pimp them? Listen, you need to put a finger on the pulse of what niggas are doing and co-opt that. Why? Because everybody here feeds off the culture, and there's only so much that white people do in feeding, and then they get niggas to do the rest so that they can maintain control from the bottom up. Now you got so-called conscious people trying to dissect Kendrick Lamar's song like it's going to tell you where the next meeting is going to be held to free yourselves. Like there's some deep in it. Like she's speaking something spiritual. Are you serious? Because she went from a nigga ain't nothing to you don't need a nigga, you understand, to popping it on stage, which was really proliferating and promoting the bar dancing, the strip club. That's all she was a strip club on stage for a couple of hours. And that she had the biggest nigga in the dope game to point she didn't even have to mention that's what he was doing. Because everybody understood. Now all of a sudden you want to attach consciousness to that? You want to attach history to that? That's disrespectful. Because you're going to do nothing with it. And it's not... And look at him and tell that he doesn't care about anybody but himself. Then again, the eyes that we've been blessed with that are internal, that will allow us to see a person and know that they're no good. That's what the older people used to say. You bring somebody by and they go, don't bring that nigga by here no more. I just look at him and tell. You can look at that nigga and tell he's a sellout. That he ain't never had nothing other than cutting a nigga's throat behind his back for. And that he's the same way. You know, so I'm like, no, we don't have no Marvin Gaye's, we don't have no Stevie Wonders, we don't have, you know, individuals singing it and or like the Earth, Wind and Fire, you know, communicating via song what was really going on. We don't have that. And fuck, what the fuck you need that for, and you live in it anyway? Because that shit all pans out to being a lullaby. You don't need to be put to sleep, you need to wake up. So I don't, you know, our ability to say is that words are more powerful than weapons because they're going to go further than a weapon. And a weapon is not going to lodge itself in your body and become part of your memory, although it can crush you physically to the point that you realize you're paralyzed. The point is that words permeate and you pass it on consciously. And so therefore it becomes this issue of us being able to communicate it unapologetically. I think that's where we begin, and from there will come in the numbers. And I don't think it'll be a lot to begin the building. I think what will happen is that we'll build and others will model and adapt it to what it is that they feel compelled to build. But that it's got to be done. And I think we got to start with, we got to put the word out, because I think from the word, you know how they say at first it was the word and then it was flesh. You know, so I do think we have to speak it. And I think that was one of the things that you've been told for generations as women. Because you think about it, for a long time, it's been the Caucasian effort. And I don't know if the so-called black man began this before the Caucasian or whether or not he was severely influenced by. But for a very long time, there's been that effort to quiet the indigenous woman, because, you know, white woman was never allowed to speak. But our struggle with that has been much longer. So to suggest that we only got on that when the white woman was saying it, to me, then you don't understand history. Because when they knocked down the initial churches, those were temples. They didn't even call them churches. They went from being called temple to churches. Why? Because when they were called temples, that was because we were the heads and they called us oracles. So it went from being temples with oracles to churches with priests. And then when it was co-opted by Caucasians and then came down to be called churches and black men allowed in, it went from priest to pastor. You know, so you're seeing the evolution right behind, but before your eyes, but in not knowing the history, you don't understand that it began with a struggle to silence her from the very beginning. And they only bring you up to speed when it start being a little frick frack between you and him. But before it was you and him, it was her and her and you, because you side with him against her, is your reality. And it only flipped you out because he went and imprisoned you like the two of you had co-opted to imprison her. That's what freaked the black man out. And that's why to the majority, with the majority of them, their argument is only for black men. They only talk about homosexuality as it relates to the black man. They do not talk to you about lesbianism unless they feel that black women who are lesbians or black women who are conducting a movement and then they're going to call you a lesbian is making headway and leaving them out or behind. Other than that, he is only talking about homosexuality as it affects the male population. In the 60s, he was like, don't you talk about what you need. Hold up. Wait a minute. Black women are being raped and murdered. What do you mean? I don't give a shit about what this white woman's agenda is, because you had no problem accepting white people's help when it could move your agenda forward. But you saying to her she can't accept white women's help when it's to move her agenda forward, which was to keep black women from being raped. Now, I don't understand that. And none of us are talking about that. And yet and still that is a real part of our history, and it'll give us a better understanding of what this fight really is about. You know, so I said, well, no, we're going to have to tell the story. The story is that you want to, in suppressing her, who physically she's symbolic of the spirit. So you can, I said to somebody, you cut her out the story and you on the pathway to homosexuality there. So you ain't got to deal with nothing else that he's doing. Just cut her out the story and see where you go. Yeah, and then to understand that when you do that and she's symbolic of the spirit, then you can't function as anything other than a beast without the spirit. That we're talking a spiritual thing here. And that to do that on the physical, you're also doing it on the spiritual, because as above, so below, and vice versa. And you don't understand this because he got you focused on the so-called physical aspect of it. And you're dealing with what you think the impact is physically. It's spiritual. You cannot cut her out, and you cannot disrespect her and think that you're not taking yourself out of existence. And that's what, to me, homosexuality represents. You will no longer matter. So and I said, and you doing it with your own mouth. I said, because it's with the tongue that life and death is the power in. So when you verbally communicate that, I told you, taking yourself out of existence. You really don't understand the level of disrespect you are engaging on when you say things towards her as such, because you're talking to the spirit that has brought you into existence. I said, but that's what the devil does, is get you to misunderstand what the situation is. So if we don't come forth and tell the story, the whole story will not be told. And the reason we can't move forward is because we have an incomplete story. And they're under the impression that, oh, it's to remove the man because the man is a fighter. Nigga, you ain't fought since I don't know when. And I can recall a story where the man had decided not to fight, and the Zinga got the women together and said, now, if they won't fight, we will. Exactly. Exactly. I remember this. Yes, I remember stories where the women said, if you didn't fight, guess what? You ain't got no home. You understand? That's the point. It is out of that mind that is created to take care of, that has the answers of building to secure the nurturing of. That's why it's in her. Because within her is that responsibility of caring for. And as that child is developing within your womb comes also the knowledge of how to secure that child from within, and the same externally. Now that's God-given. Who can come against that? How you beefing with that? How you trying to overtopple that and don't think that that's going to bring you remorse? There is an order. There is a hierarchy. And I think where we are is where we are. But where we have stepped down, we have done so because others have determined that we should. And I know there was a lot of fighting. And I know that what happened was, whereas there were some who used to hold to what was natural and who used to be our protector, decided no longer to be our protection. And that's when things got out of hand. Because not only did we have, how do you say, when in the house it falls apart, but then you got the outsides coming in too. And that's when the fall occurred, because the split was with us. That split didn't occur in the 60s. Don't Nothing just happened all of a sudden. It was a ripple, and it came, or it evolved into something bigger. It's been a split with us for a very long time. And we need to deal with it and discuss it without the emotionalism that they obviously are overcome with, to the point that we can't even talk about it. So how can we fix it? Grace gives you enough time to breathe and reflect without the distractions. That was grace. And you and I both know grace don't last forever.